Sometimes the difference between a show that endures and a show that fades away isn't so much the overall quality of the show, episode to episode, but more the cumulative impression of it. As a case in point, let's look at the mid-1990s for the single season of Space Above and Beyond alongside the first season of Babylon 5. Both were new sci-fi franchises with no existing fan bases. Both were neglected by their networks with mediocre marketing and bad scheduling. Fox regularly preempted Above and Beyond for football. I only saw 3 episodes when it originally aired.
You're dead! You're dead! The entire squad is dead! And it's your fault! Now get out!
Babylon 5 was notorious for being bounced around the lineup due to a lot of contract issues going at the time with the formation of the UPN, the WB, their overlap with Fox, the network politics as a whole saga of its own. The short of it being that both shows were hard to watch because you had to be a little lucky to catch them. And they both shared some common themes along with a variation in quality from episode to episode. Some were great and fed into the wider narrative being built up. For example, Signs and Portents for Babylon 5 or Eyes for Above and Beyond. Others were not good. Above and Beyond was the more consistent show. Surrounding standout episodes like Who Monitors the Birds, Above and Beyond was mostly solid but rarely exceptional. I don't talk about shows here unless I like something about them, but it's kind of like pasta, always filling and rarely inedible, but it's never going to be as good as a steak cooked just right. But Above and Beyond deserves credit for trying to do something that Babylon 5 didn't. The B5 crew were in the Star Trek mold. The stories followed the command staff right in the middle of the big decisions. Above and Beyond instead followed the soldiers, people that enact the big decisions without really knowing how it all fits together. Having pilots doubling as infantry muddied this a little, like the show couldn't fully commit to one perspective. But by shifting the perspective from ship captains and ambassadors to junior officers, it gave a different and refreshing take on the interstellar war with echoes of Haldeman's Forever War. But it could have gone further by splitting the group into pilots and infantry, giving us Star Wars space combat alongside the Band of Brothers in Space angle that some episodes are built on. Which brings up the subject of thematic influences. Above and Beyond gives us a military campaign that stylistically has a lot of Vietnam influence, but is more World War II Pacific theater in its story structure. Carrier-based fighters, island hopping. It's a solid foundation, but an obvious one. Babylon 5 took a different route. It's in many ways a Cold War story, but not in the familiar American us versus the evil empire way. The Earth Alliance is a middling power in this story. There's a United States versus Soviet Union allegory at work, but it's between the Shadows and Vorlons. Earth is more like France, very much a real power, but a junior partner in someone else's alliance. Maybe a little proud beyond its real standing. But it's also a decolonization story on many levels. There's the threat of the Centauri domination of the Narn, a people that have recently gained their independence after centuries of occupation. Right from the first episode, the show runs with this tension between Jakar, the new ambassador trying to assert himself and his people as equal players on the galactic stage, and Londo, the Centauri aristocrat having to engage with them as a legitimate nation rather than the slaves they've been for his entire life.
I hear there is a famine on your world's southern frontier. My condolences.
You should have thought of that before you strip-mined our resources.
Ah, so it is all our fault,
Precisely.
But it's there in the wider narrative, too. The first episode presents a hierarchy of all the ambassadors. Nominally, they're all equals, but Kosh, the Vorlon ambassador, is more equal than the others, to use Orwellian phrasing. Throughout the season, we get clues about the other power block, the bad guys lurking out in the darkness with their own proxies and vassals. Morden enters the story, acting as their agent to build contacts with the enemy and ensnare prominent people in webs of favors and blackmail.
You have a problem, Ambassador Malari. Quadrant 37? We can fix it for you if you let us.
He's almost a personified representation of the CIA. Or the KGB. It doesn't really matter which, because from the perspective of the lesser powers, they're the same. Agents of manipulation. Both sides profess an ideology, but they're fighting over their own interests. It isn't paid off until several seasons later, but the central thread of the show is about these younger civilizations breaking free of outside control, of being tools of someone else and finding their own way forward. In the first season, we're constantly fed pieces of this, a slow but steady burn toward a climax. Above and Beyond is much less deliberate about its story. It gives us an alien threat that appears to attack without provocation, which sets the stage for teasing out their motives. But it doesn't give us much to work with until the end of the season, aside from straight up telling us that an offensive is planned.
Sometime in the coming weeks, the forces of Earth will engage in a major offensive, landing a massive expeditionary force in the Ceres star system.
It introduces the silicates, androids that eventually rebel, leading to a big war that spurred them to breed in vitros to fill out the ranks. But it isn't explored in much depth as to why the society can't seem to function without a near-slave underclass. The pieces for good critiques are there, but not much is done with them. Both series share a hard look at authoritarian tendencies in our own society, much more obvious today than at the time. In one of Above and Beyond's best episodes, Who Monitors the Birds, it's explored through Hawks, an in vitro who in the first episode is sentenced to the Marine Corps as punishment for some criminal offense. In this episode, there's a dual thread, cutting between a mission to kill an enemy officer and flashbacks of Hawk's early life in the factory setting of in vitro birth and indoctrination. He's a product made to serve the state. And there's a scene of the entire brood going through an indoctrination session that's equal parts North Korean brainwashing and American public school. And he dares to ask an impertinent question that cuts to the core of every single ideology of hierarchical control, from monarchy to Marxism and all the democracy shell games in between.
Who monitors the birds? I monitor the birds. Who monitors you?
For this, they deem him defective and send him to be killed, forcing him to defend himself, for which they will kill him. That's some hard-hitting commentary wrapped in a good character story. Unfortunately, it's one of the few times Above and Beyond really goes for it. Similar themes are explored in Babylon 5. For example, the episode Eyes, in which the central government sends a team of investigators to confirm the loyalty of the crew, complete with vague accusations, telepaths to probe their thoughts, and political agendas.
Similar investigations are taking place on all our outposts. We must know who is loyal to Earth Force and who isn't.
Above and Beyond also displays the same kind of cynicism about government in its own episode titled Eyes, about an establishment politician trying to have her more radical rival assassinated. The people might vote the wrong way, after all.
Have you ever betrayed your country?
I won't answer that question.
Babylon 5 used interesting characters to tell a political story about power, war, and the corruptibility of people, while Above and Beyond had characters that could be interesting sometimes in a war started by some politicians that lie a lot. The former had a clear plan with plot milestones, while the latter lacked that sense of momentum. But the 90s were a long time ago, bringing us to the question of reboots, which have been suggested for both shows. And it may surprise you that I think Space Above and Beyond is the better candidate for a reboot. Babylon 5, despite problems with the network and the constant threat of cancellation forcing them to tell a 5-season story in 4 seasons, only to then get a 5th season anyway, did what it set out to do. Above and Beyond didn't get to tell its story, partly because the network killed it prematurely, but partly because it didn't seem to know what story it was trying to tell. It has all the pieces of something great. While remaking Babylon 5 runs the risk of alienating fans of the original as much as drawing them in and will never really escape the shadow of its predecessor, Space Above and Beyond is a bin full of great parts that just need to be put together the right way. It has a lot to say about themes of creeping totalitarianism and corruptibility, issues that are even more relevant today than they were in the first iteration of the series, and I think it really deserves a second chance to tell its story.
Now, if we can only find this Chiggy von Richthofen.
I would have gone with Baron von Chigtofen.